In episode 49, titled Vulnerability Analysis Mini-Scenarios, we're going to use rapid scenarios to build decision skill under uncertainty, which is exactly what real assessments feel like when the clock is running and the evidence is incomplete. In practice, you rarely get a perfectly labeled problem with a neat solution path. You get partial signals, competing priorities, and constraints that limit what you can safely do next. Mini scenarios are a way to practice the muscle that matters most, deciding the next best action that increases certainty without increasing risk. This is not about memorizing tool output or reciting definitions. It is about thinking like a tester who can triage, validate, and communicate under pressure. By the end, the goal is that your decisions feel structured even when the situation is messy. The drill method is intentionally simple because the point is speed and consistency, not complexity. You listen to the scenario, then identify the clue, meaning the single most important signal that should drive your next move. Next, you choose the next step, and the next step should be something that increases your certainty about what is real without causing harm or drifting out of scope. Finally, you justify the choice in plain language, tying it back to phase, scope, and safety constraints rather than personal preference. This method forces you to avoid the common trap of jumping straight to exploitation because it feels productive, even when you do not yet have confirmation. It also forces you to articulate why you are doing what you are doing, which is a critical skill for reporting and stakeholder communication. With practice, this drill becomes a habit that keeps your work defensible. Scenario 1 starts with a scan result that looks alarming, but the task is to interpret it and choose safe validation rather than panic. Imagine a vulnerability scanner reports a critical remote code execution issue on a service identified by a version fingerprint, but the environment is known to use reverse proxies and managed services. The clue is that the finding is based on fingerprinting, which is a weaker signal than behavioral confirmation, especially when intermediaries may change what you see. The safe next step is to corroborate the service identity and exposure through configuration evidence or controlled low-risk requests that confirm whether the vulnerable feature is reachable. You aim to confirm whether the actual backend is the vulnerable component and whether the vulnerable path is accessible from your vantage point. This kind of validation produces a reliable classification without introducing load or unstable inputs that could disrupt service. Alternative choices fail in Scenario 1 for predictable reasons, and naming those reasons helps you internalize the boundaries. Jumping straight to exploit code is often wrong phase because you have not yet established that the vulnerable condition exists in the environment you can actually reach. It can also be wrong scope if exploitation was not authorized or if it would change state in ways you do not need to prove the point. Aggressive probing can be too risky if the service is production critical, because a scanner's critical label does not give you permission to treat availability as expendable. Another weak alternative is to dismiss the finding immediately because you suspect fingerprint error, which can be a wrong assumption that causes you to miss a real issue. The disciplined answer is to validate with the smallest action that changes uncertainty into certainty. That is the difference between professional triage and emotional triage. Scenario 2 begins with observing a web behavior and inferring the likely weakness from what the application does, not from what you hope it does. Suppose you notice that when you request a resource identifier you should not own, the application returns a normal success response but with another user's data. The clue is that access control appears to be enforced by the client's choice of identifier rather than by server-side authorization rules. The likely weakness is an authorization failure consistent with insecure direct object reference style behavior, where the application trusts user-controlled identifiers without verifying ownership. You do not need to perform loud testing to see the pattern. The response behavior is already telling you what the enforcement model might be. Your job is to treat that clue as a hypothesis and choose the next step that confirms it safely without pulling more data than necessary. The best next action in Scenario 2 is to increase certainty without causing harm, which means you validate with minimal, non-destructive confirmation. You choose a small set of controlled requests that test whether the authorization boundary is consistently missing, using the least sensitive targets and the smallest number of attempts needed to demonstrate the issue. You avoid actions that modify data, trigger bulk exports, or scrape large sets of records, because those increase operational and privacy risk without improving the clarity of the finding. You also capture minimal evidence, such as one request and response pair that clearly demonstrates access to an unauthorized object, with any sensitive content minimized in how you record it. The goal is to prove the existence and scope boundary of the weakness, not to harvest data. That distinction matters because defenders need a fixed target, not a demonstration of how far you could go if you behaved badly. Scenario 3 shifts to identity clues because many real compromises hinge on misscoped access rather than classic software exploitation. Imagine you are reviewing identity and access information, and you discover a service account that appears to have broad permissions across multiple systems, and you also notice a pattern of tokens or credentials being used in automation contexts. The clue is overprivileged combined with automation, which often means that a compromise of one system could cascade into higher privileges through that service account's permissions. A cautious test here focuses on verifying what the identity can do and where it is used, rather than attempting to assume the identity in a way that could breach scope or cause disruption. You confirm privileges through policy review and controlled permission checks where authorized, documenting exactly which actions and resources are allowed. This is safer and often more informative than trying to prove compromise, because the permissions model itself is already the risk. Prioritization in Scenario 3 means choosing the highest impact path with the least disruption, which is a mindset you can apply to identity testing broadly. If the service account can modify access policies, create new credentials, or manage infrastructure, the impact of misuse is high, and confirming those privileges becomes urgent. At the same time, the least disruptive approach is to validate permissions through read-only evidence and policy interpretation, rather than making changes or triggering operational workflows. You focus on the actions that would expand blast radius, like role assumption pathways and administrative capabilities, because those define how quickly an attacker could escalate. You also consider exposure, such as where the service account's credentials live, whether they are present on multiple hosts, and whether they are accessible from less trusted systems. This prioritization approach helps you produce high-value findings without touching production systems in risky ways. Scenario 4 moves into cloud exposure, where the clue is often a configuration signal that implies reachability or public access. Imagine you see evidence that a storage resource or service endpoint is publicly accessible, or that a policy allows broad access, but you have not yet confirmed what data or functions are actually exposed. The clue is potential public exposure, which is often urgent because it expands attacker opportunity dramatically. The validation plan should start by confirming reachability from an attacker-relevant vantage point, and then confirming permissions boundaries without performing disruptive actions. You aim to determine whether read access, write access, or administrative operations are possible, and you stop when you have enough evidence to describe the exposure accurately. A careful cloud validation avoids bulk access and avoids changing state, because the point is to confirm the condition and scope, not to create operational or compliance issues. Documentation for each scenario should follow a consistent pattern that preserves credibility and supports remediation. You capture evidence, meaning the minimum artifacts needed to show what you observed, such as a configuration value, a response snippet, or a permission statement. You state confidence, meaning whether the finding is confirmed, likely, or suspected, and you explain what drives that confidence level. You note constraints, meaning scope limits, safety concerns, time windows, or visibility gaps that shaped what you could test. This documentation discipline prevents misunderstandings later because stakeholders often remember the headline but forget the nuance. It also helps remediation teams verify the fix because they can reproduce the confirmation conditions you used. In short, good notes turn many scenario decisions into real-world deliverables. Common pitfalls across scenarios tend to be the same mistakes wearing different costumes. Assumptions are the first pitfall, such as believing a version string is definitive, believing a success response implies authorization, or believing a permission label reflects actual capability without checking scope. Skipped steps are another pitfall, where a tester jumps from a clue straight to a heavy action without confirming phase-appropriate facts first. Overreach is the most serious pitfall, where someone escalates testing beyond authorization, gathers more sensitive data than needed, or uses aggressive methods that create operational risk. Another subtle pitfall is treating tool silence as safety, which shows up when people assume a lack of findings means the environment is clean, despite clear evidence of blind spots. These pitfalls are avoidable when you stick to the drill and treat safety as core constraints rather than optional etiquette. Quick wins come from asking 3 questions consistently, because those questions force clarity before action. First, what do you know? Meaning what evidence is actually present rather than inferred or assumed. Second, what do you need? Meaning what single piece of information would reduce uncertainty the most and change your next decision. Third, what is allowed? Meaning what scope and safety constraints limit your available actions right now. When you answer those questions, your next step becomes more obvious and your testing becomes more efficient. This approach also reduces the urge to do something big just to feel progress, because it keeps progress defined as increased certainty, not increased activity. Under exam conditions and real assessment conditions, this mindset keeps you aligned with defensible decision-making. To keep the drill sticky, use this memory phrase: clue, phase, constraint, next step. Clue reminds you to identify the key signal rather than chasing every detail at once. Phase reminds you to choose an action appropriate to where you are in the process, such as validation before exploitation and scope checking before escalation. Constraint reminds you that safety, authorization, and operational stability are real limits that shape what good work looks like. Next step reminds you that your job in each mini-scenario is not to solve everything immediately, but to choose the one action that increases certainty with minimal risk. If you can repeat that phrase in your head during triage, your decisions will be more consistent and more professional. To conclude episode 49, titled Vulnerability Analysis Mini-Scenarios, remember that the drill approach is a way to practice judgment under uncertainty, not a trick for gaming a tool. You identify the best clue, choose a phase-appropriate next step, respect constraints, and justify your decision in plain language that a teammate can follow. Over time, this becomes the habit that keeps you from rushing into risky actions, keeps you from dismissing real risk, and keeps your work aligned with scope and stability. Mini-scenarios train you to be calm and methodical when evidence is partial, which is when mistakes are easiest to make. If you can apply this drill consistently, you will not only answer exam questions better, you will also produce cleaner findings, safer validation, and more credible recommendations in real engagements. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.